Let's start with China, because obviously we've seen how much of a growth trajectory China has been on over the last 20, 22 years, ever since it joined the WTO club. And no longer it's just the producer of cheap plastic toys. It is now an absolute champion in many ways. EVs, for example, I think we all read that headline. BYD is now the biggest maker of electric vehicles, surpassing Tesla, which is pretty tremendous, and very few of us know BYD, but this essentially is showcases how strong China has become. Batteries, vertical integration, China has it all. Diane, in a nutshell, how far has China come, and can the rest of the world stay competitive?
Thank you very much. I'm struggling here with a notebook and a microphone and a pen, so forgive me if I drop something. So it's a great question, and the situation with China is often framed as a race, as a competition. So I want to start out by reframing a little bit and saying Europe has benefited a lot from China's growth and its advances in technology. In a globalized world, you get gains from trade and comparative advantage, including trade and ideas. So I think that's been very positive. Something like advances in photovoltaics and the fact that the price has come down so much, and the transition to renewable energy will be consequently much cheaper and easier. That's a good thing for us. So we couldn't and shouldn't be inventing everything ourselves. Obviously, it's been a labour market shock as well, but in a sense, that shock has happened. And the one that we've been discussing here is the automation shock to the labour market. So I think the question is, what lessons can we learn? You can think about that big jump in trade openness as a kind of new technology. So we ought to be able to learn some lessons about how we manage the labour transition in Europe from that. But of course, the geopolitical context has changed, and we've had the supply chain shocks, so I will mention those as you trailed. I think there's also been a reappraisal of policy ideas in the last few years, and we are moving from a world in which the emphasis was all on liberalisation, free market, globalisation. And I see that as changing quite substantially now. And if you think back, it was only 2019, the Siemens-Alstom decision. I think that might go a different way if it were happening today. Partly because we've seen that the big US companies and Chinese companies are playing by different rules in European markets. But partly, I think, and this is happening inside economics, it's an understanding that you can't really separate the know-how in research and development and design from the understanding you gain from actually manufacturing things. And so that transplanting of manufacturing that we thought was going to be fine, I think there have been some costs to that in terms of know-how and expertise that we're only just beginning to realise. But I still don't think we should see R&D and technology as only a competition with China. We should be asking, what are we good at? We've got skilled people, we've got sophisticated financial markets, there's a big single market in Europe, but also what do our societies need, and how will everybody gain from that? Because the fundamental question facing us now, we've got a very severe short-term shock from supply chains, but also Ukraine and what's happening in energy markets. But we've also had a terrible decade or decade and a half for living standards, and we need to show that all of the investments that we're making in research are going to deliver for people here. So that's what I would see as the big problem. I'd see that as much more important than any notional race with other countries.
So basically, Diane, you say you want to rephrase the term competition somewhat, but now, in the middle of 2022, we're all in a competition when it comes to resources, when it comes to inputs and materials. Lisandra, you've done a lot of research on that, which is very enlightening. Tell us a little bit about what you found out and how incredibly dependent German companies, the EU is on China, or is that usually overstated? Are we less dependent than we think?
Yeah, sorry. China plays a very important role in general for the German economy, but not a dominant role if you look at the whole supply chain, right? So if you look at trading goods, China emerged as the main partner for trading goods for the German economy. So 9.5% of the trade is is with China, right? But if you look at the whole supply chain, so the direct and indirect linkages along the whole supply chain, then we see that the linkages or the value added created, for instance, with trade with the US is still much higher than with China. Right? So in a general sense, then we can say, yeah, China is an extremely important partner, but does not play a really dominant role. Now, if we dig a deeper into these dependencies, then we see, so first, two aspects. So first, we have conducted a survey with enterprises and asked them whether they are reliant on important inputs from China. And there we see that almost half of the manufacturing firms they respond that they are reliant on important inputs from China. And of those, half of these firms are planning to reduce imports in the future. Then when we ask why, the most important reason is to reduce dependencies from China. So it seems to be a China plus one strategy in the sense that firms are aiming to reduce these dependencies, in particular supply chains. And but if we look at the pandemic, for instance, what we have seen in the last 2 years is that shortages of few inputs can already lead to great disruptions in supply chains. And that's why it's also important to look at the product level. And this is what we have done in two different studies. So in one of them, we have looked at dependencies at the product level and how large are these dependencies from China. And then we see some sectors such as chemical sector or electronic components where we see particular products that are highly dependent from the Chinese economy. And in a recent study, we have looked at key technologies that we produce in Europe or that we need, so that we need for the energy transition, for instance. And we have evaluated where do we source these raw materials from that we need for the production of these key technologies in Europe. And there we see, for instance, that for China, so we have identified 9 critical raw materials which are used in several of these key technologies, so for lithium batteries and several other technologies that we need for the energy transition. And we identified 9 critical raw materials that we need for several technologies and where we have a high supplier concentration. And for 7 out of these 9, China is top 5 exporter. So, and this indicates that, in particular sectors, and especially for industrial goods, this is less severe, but in particular when it comes to raw materials, then this dependency is much higher.
Gabriel, we'll come to Latin America and you in just a second. I just want to dwell on China just a tiny bit longer because it seems like China has done a lot of things right, apart from the fact that China is pretty lucky when it comes to many of the raw materials and the rare earths, for example. But the industrial policy behind it seems to have been one of the key drivers behind China's tremendous success. Shouldn't we think a little bit more like China, Diane?
I think we should be thinking more about strategic management of the economy. And that's what went out of fashion intellectually in economics, certainly, and therefore got picked up in policy. I mean, particularly in the UK, where we have been much more free market about it. There are trade-offs, of course. I mean, competition in our own markets and avoiding subsidy. We learned long ago that there were definitely costs to that. So I would be cautious about it. So I wouldn't phrase it so much as industrial policy as strategic thinking about what are the important sectors, what are the critical materials, and having a long view about that. Things like setting standards, which has served Europe so well in mobile telephony, for instance. That's a great example of a good industrial policy. So yes, but with caution about industrial lobbying and special interests.
Let's talk about Latin America, and then we can tie it all together towards the end. I think it's already turned on. Jose, your real name, everyone calls you Gabriel, correct? So, okay, I'll call you Gabriel from now on. China doesn't just want to trade or be vertically integrated, doesn't just want to trade with the EU, but has a very, very strong footprint in Africa, but also in Latin America in terms of the trade relationship, but potentially also the political influence. Let's talk about trade first. What are you witnessing? How much has that strengthened?
Well, China changed from being a minor trade partner from Latin America to become one of the main destinations of Latin American exports and source of Latin American imports. In South America in particular, is the first trade partner for the South American countries. It stole some market share from the US and from other Latin American countries, but not from the European Union. The market share of the European Union in Latin American imports is more or less the same. And indeed, it had a strong influence in the region in economic terms because we have a period of very rapid growth between 2004 and 2019. Which is related to this expansion of the Chinese market. The big problem is that it has been a trade based on commodities from Latin America and high-tech industrial or medium-tech industrial goods from China. But this is not that different from what we have with the European Union. It's more or less the same pattern. This is a Latin American problem, not a Chinese, or not the result of the Chinese expansion in trade.
Sorry, just to interrupt here. That means you say the trade based on the commodity super cycle, that's not sustainable as such.
Yeah.
Just trading commodities won't serve Latin America well.
Yes, this has been trading commodities has been the main driver of growth until 2019. But let me say that this super cycle already was somehow declining by the end of the period. And indeed, if you look at Latin America between 2009 and 2017, it only grew 0.8% annually. So the structural problems of Latin America, which are related to the lack of diversification, are still there. The response, perhaps in the line of what Diane mentioned, some more strategic thinking. I think somehow Latin America was the developing region that bought ipsis literis the Washington Consensus and applied very free market policies that left the country to remain concentrated on a few commodity exports. We need more industrial policy, more strategic thinking, more technological policy to really change this pattern of diversification if we want to really move towards a more sustainable rate of growth in the long run.
The problem with many Latin American countries is that there is mismanagement, and in the government there is a certain sense of corruption. We saw a big scandal in Brazil many years ago. Politics is back at the forefront in Mexico, but also in Brazil, where we see elections this October. Is there a sense that because of many of the economic crises that these countries have been through, COVID, for example, now huge inflation problem, economic problems, that the left will come to power again?
Yes, we see now that in Colombia, in Chile, and probably in Brazil, center-left parties are coming back to power. And this reflects, I think, basically one of the greatest problems of Latin America, which is inequality. So we have to think of more redistributive policies along with industrial policy to diversify the economy, but hand in hand with stronger social and redistributive policies. Just to give an example, if you look at Uruguay, my country, the Gini of Uruguay before tax and transfers is more or less similar to Denmark. But when you look at the Gini after tax and transfers, in Denmark it falls to half, no? And in Uruguay it falls just a little. So really we have a political economy problem, and we need to tackle this. The last thing that I would like to say is that we are a bit concerned with looking at the relationship with China, as you mentioned, as a problem, as a political problem. From Latin American perspective, it is important to keep open all the doors for trade. China has become a very important trade partner, and we would not like to see the options very much restrained because political hegemony dispute in the region.
Mm-hmm. That's a very important point. Let me pick up on that. Before that, though, coming back to Brazil, we've got a Brazilian on the panel here. Any further comments from you on the political movement, not necessarily just Brazil, but the reaction in Latin America to many of the economic problems and what that means politically?
Yeah, so still Latin American countries, and taking the example, for instance, from the Mercosur states, right? Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, they have a low degree of integration in global supply chains. Right? And if you look at policies, these are countries with high, still relatively protectionist, a high number of protectionist measures. So when it comes to tariffs, but also to non-tariff barriers. And this is really a constraint, especially when it comes to complex value chains, which cross-border, where intermediate goods cross-border more than once to produce a final good. And we still see, a low degree of integration in global supply chains. And what we have seen in the late years, as Jose already mentioned earlier, was first an increase with trade with China. So in 20 years, the share of trade increased from 2% to 22%. So China is now the main trading partner for Latin American countries. And we also see a shift in the composition of exports, in the sense of more primary products being exported, right? Low value-added goods. So a shift from manufacturing towards more agriculture and mineral products. And this is, again, so going back to this issue, also driven by by China. Partially, we see a bit of a shift in trade in exports, but yeah. So it comes then back to this question of how can we foster integration of these countries in global supply chains, and currently. Latin American countries, but in particular the Mercosur countries, they have a very low number of trade agreements. Right? They are not much integrated in global supply chains, and even within the group. So where you expect that the integration works, then you have still barriers, and especially a lot of non-tariff barriers within the region, which also increase production costs and then hinders also the integration in supply chains.
I want to come back to the point that Gabriel made about who your trading partners are, and if at some point we'll have to pick and choose, because now we know we're far off the peaks of multilateralism, and in terms of the globalization, we're far off the peaks that we saw probably at the height of the early 2000s. Is block building the future, or in other terms, do we believe that at some point the EU will have to pick and choose whether we trade with China or the US? And when it comes to Latin America, will Latin America be on the Chinese side because they've grown so close?
Yes, I think perhaps what I will say perhaps it's a bit controversial, but I think that in the international political economy, the big problem is not China. The big problem is the way that globalization, the form that globalization took from the 90s to our days. This idea of Danny Roderick of hyper-globalization in which the regulation of the markets, in particular the financial markets, put a heavy cost in terms of inequality, not only in developing economies, also in the developed economy. So I think we have a challenge in redefining the international political system. And perhaps in this sense, the example of the European Union and the values of Europe in this process of reformulating the trade and financial system are very important. There is a discussion which I like very much, although I don't believe it will work very easily, which is the idea of democracy enhancing multilateralism, which is Robert Keohane, a international political economist of the US have suggested, or democracy enhancing international governance, which is to see how we manage to combine multilateral rules, which the need to create more fiscal space and more policy space for industrial policy in the developing world and for more social and full employment policies in the global system. So to secure an expansion of aggregate demand at a global level that ensures moving towards full employment.
It seems noble and very ambitious. Diane, I mentioned the word block building versus multilateralism. Now, these are two ends of the spectrum. In the middle, we see something like friendshoring. Will that work? Do we really know who our friends going to be from a trade perspective? They may be our friends today, but not necessarily tomorrow.
I think we're quite likely to see a bit more regionalization of trade. But we spent 40, 50 years building an open economy with these very disaggregated supply chains that benefit from specialization. And if we really reverse that, the costs are going to be high indeed. There's still a lot of mutual advantage in this trade. So I would hope it doesn't go too far. I agree with Gabrielle. I think trade is the wrong target here. It isn't just in Latin America that we've seen political polarization and inequality. It's happening in Europe. The China trade shock on jobs had as damaging an effect in Germany and other European countries in terms of job quality and pay outcomes for displaced workers as the United States did. So I think the real priority is these labour market transitions and more broadly making sure that we get the economy growing, we get it innovating, and that growth benefits more people than has been the case in the past couple of decades. And that will take different kinds of policies, but I think that's a much more important target than worrying about trade and competition with China or whatever.
Lisandra, comment?
On block building and decoupling. So first, we also see that in the data, indeed, that we see a trend towards more a regionalization of supply chains. That, for instance, we talk about global supply chains, but most of the value added is created within a region, right? So we have these three hubs: United States, Europe, and China, and a large portion of the value added is created inside these big hubs. And we see that, for instance, for Germany, the European Union became more important over the years in terms of value-added creation. So we see this increase in the regionalization of global value chains. And I fully agree that decoupling and block building would lead to massive welfare effects, not only for the European Union, but also for the developing countries, so also for Latin America, and also for China. So it's also important to emphasize that we always, or in general, we talk about dependencies from China, but if you look at the value-added creation, China, if you take the EU as a whole, the EU is the main supplier of intermediate inputs that China needs for the final production, which means that we have this double-sided dependency. So also the Chinese final production is highly reliant on inputs coming in particular from Europe. So on second comes the United States, but Europe is the main supplier of intermediate inputs for the Chinese economy. And so it means that also if you talk about decoupling or then we can show that in quantitative exercises, as we would expect it would decrease welfare in both for both regions. But also if we think of supply chains in the short run, this would lead to massive disruptions in supply chains.
I think from an economic model perspective, I think we all agree it leads to welfare losses. Mm-hmm. It lowers economic growth. It increases social injustice. That doesn't seem to be what policymakers, especially in China and many, more protectionist countries, aren't looking at. Even in Europe, what we see right now, member states are very much looking at strategic autonomy and silently are adopting some protectionist measures. Given the energy crisis that we're in right now, isn't it a pipe dream to think that we can still be fully integrated, we can maximize welfare? Isn't this the top of the agenda right now?
Oh, I would say especially now especially now with the war in the Ukraine, what is crystal clear is that we have to reduce these one-sided dependencies, right? So to reduce dependencies in particular sectors and in particular products. So when I talked about raw materials, I think this is one example of the type of dependencies that we have to reduce, and then design policies, so trade agreements with further countries. And if we're talking about Latin America, it's important to emphasize the Mercosur-EU trade agreement, which has been negotiated for 20 years now, but has not been ratified yet. And it's an opportunity to reduce costs with a region where we trade which we trade less, right? And to foster then new business opportunities for firms in these additional regions. And so I think the question is how to design then policies to enable firms or to support firms in diversifying more their supply chains and reducing these one-sided dependencies from specific markets.
But I'd put the emphasis less on reducing dependencies and more on building the capabilities. So developing new firms that can grow and innovate in new technologies.
But that takes years. That's the problem.
It does take years, and I think we're in for a rough few years.
Absolutely. Zandra, coming back to one point that you made in terms of an EU-wide response, in terms of building new dependencies or new trade relationships when it comes to sourcing inputs, for example, from Latin America. Do we really expect the EU to do this on an EU-wide level, or will member states move solo when it comes to this?
Let me put a good example, which is the ratification of the CETA agreement with Canada. So it gives some hope that we are moving forward in terms of trade agreements. But it is indeed the case that we have not, so the EU has not really come forward when it comes to signing additional trade agreements with further regions. And then, but the multilateralism should be, so at first then we can also go further, and should that be at the EU level, or should we talk about WTO and how to reform the WTO?
That's a whole different panel.
Yes. So how macro you want to go, and which policies can you design at the EU level or the country level? So, yeah.
Actually, I spoke to a former Deputy Director General of the WTO last week, and he recognized the need for more bilateral deals and the role of the WTO in working alongside these bilateral deals. So that may be the path forward for the WTO to remain relevant. But coming back to Latin America, how important is it for the EU to speak in one unified voice when it comes to making new trade arrangements? Or do you think Latin America, everyone will just, pick the specific export markets, Germany, for example, France, the UK?
No, I think it's important to have the European Union speaking with one voice. And indeed, as Lisandra mentioned, the problem has been that trade negotiations have been too much protracted, and in this case, the agreement with the trade agreement with the Mercosur is almost 20 years. We have one of the negotiators here in this room, and it's very frustrating in this sense. But I think the key idea is precisely to keep openness as much as possible to prevent this collapse and fragmentation of trade. International cooperation, I think, is more needed than ever. The war, in particular, the war and the pandemic first and the war later, somehow hide the key issue, for instance, of climate change. But I would also say the key issue of development, which create as well negative externalities for the developed economies. The migration problem, for instance, the hundreds of people that die crossing the Mediterranean. I mean, there is a cost in terms of the lack of international cooperation, which is knocking on the doors of both developing and developing countries, and it could be really a tragedy if geopolitical suspicions and lead to a loss of this momentum of the effort to increase international cooperation.
Speaking of international cooperation, we saw some of it also in the face of seemingly Chinese dominance when it comes to conquering. Conquering is a strong word, but in terms of trying to influence trade with Latin America, but also Africa. The G7, they put out a package worth billions and billions of euros to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. Is that enough in a way to counter the influence of China? Again, Diane, you say this isn't necessarily a competition, but the EU needs to have, and the G7 overall, needs to step it up a little bit, doesn't it?
Yes, I agree. Although I think both China and recipient countries are revisiting the merits of the Belt and Road Initiative, which has had some, quite well-known issues with it. I mean, obviously, assisting developing countries, even at a time of tight budgets and recession, is going to continue to be important for exactly the reasons Gabriel has said. And climate change is going to make that worse. We are looking at a world where there will be millions of climate refugees if we don't tackle that problem quickly. So behind your question, I would agree with the spirit of it, that there is just a lot more stepping up to be done in the face of these very large global challenges. Local issues about what's happening to labour market transitions will seem quite minor by comparison if we don't tackle those big international issues.
Lisandra, does global cooperation, does it need to be financed by the big guys, by the big clubs, G7, or can trade still happen, and wielding influence, can it still happen on a more local, regional level?
We see, I mean, the developing countries have a high demand for building infrastructure. So I think China was just, feeling this demand from developing countries. But also the EU has, with the connectivity initiative and connectivity strategy that has been out for a few years now, right, has also massively invested in this in developing countries, but not as strategically. That's the crucial difference, I think. That if we compare China with the investments from the EU. the question is, how we have seen. I mean, China has shown already in several ways that they are. They are willing to use their trade relations to achieve political objectives. That's for sure. But this is the question is, how can we build economic relations that make also these countries, right? So developing countries less dependent from one particular country. Because what is really critical is, as I mentioned before, in the case of when we talk about dependency from Russian energy, are these one-sided dependencies, right? And this is what not only what we should do within the EU, but how can developing countries, or how can we help them foster first growth and also investment, and to become less reliant on one single country. Yeah.
Before we open it up to the audience for questions, Diane, I want to take it back to the labor market. And I think you said in your opening statements, you said, maybe it's good that there is going to be more competition again, because with this the very specific value chains that we've had in place before these big ruptures, the different parts were maybe too specialized and there wasn't enough competition. Now with this increasing drive for regionalization, deglobalization, is that one of the silver linings also for the labor markets, for competition to come back into the market?
Well, I think there are two issues. One is that if your value chains are too specialized, you have eliminated competition, and economists think competition is good for markets, so a bit more at those pinch points is going to be a good thing. But for the labour market, the key issues, and that's what we were all discussing yesterday, is creating high-skilled, high-wage jobs, and not reversing, but correcting some of the damage done by the hollowing out of the labour market that we've seen in the past 20 years or so. And that's a challenge for innovation policy, for finance policies to enable growing companies, for making sure the market scales up, for using public procurement sensibly, for setting standards. All of those kinds of industrial policy issues are the ones where we should be focusing when it comes to labour market transitions. Because in every wave of automation and trade liberalisation, we've done a pretty bad job at helping people through those transitions. And the China shock in particular, people have generally become re-employed in flexible labour markets, but in lower quality and lower paid jobs. And that's not a good outcome. So I hope that what this project is doing is helping us learn some of those policy lessons about how to handle the next transition, which is coming along much better than we did previously. What are the steps that need to be taken to handle this more efficiently? Active labour market policies, flexicurity, skills training, and a strategic view of what's the role of government in the economy, which does involve not placing bets in the old-fashioned industrial policy way, but identifying strengths and making sure that you've got supply chains in place to do that, that you've got the skills in place to do that, and that everybody's efforts are aligned towards where your strengths are so that you can create all of these high-value activities.
It sounds easier said than done, but...
It's not easy.
Lisandra, do you see a massive opportunity with the current global forces, global economic and political forces, to bring some of the production back, nearshoring, reshoring, regionalization? Is this Europe's chance to upgrade skilled labor again?
Yeah, so first of all, we have also conducted quantitative exercises showing the effect of nearshoring, and this would lead to massive welfare losses. So if we would reshore the production, right, to neighboring countries. So first we have to say that in terms of labor market outcomes, but also in general in terms of welfare effects, we have to ask how much are we willing to give up, right? So we have conducted several counterfactual exercises showing the effect of reshoring, but also showing the effect of nearshoring. And in the case of nearshoring, we also see what could be also, we think is also interesting that also the neighboring countries do not necessarily win from reshoring production, because it would also in these, let's say, neighboring countries, you would have a reduction in aggregate productivity, because we would have a switch towards sectors which are less productive, and so in general, so if you take aggregate outcomes, then these would actually lead to welfare losses. But we do see in the data that firms are, especially when it comes to China, so many firms, when we ask firms, so if you are importing less from China, where are you aiming to import more from? And then we see that most of the firms, actually 80% of the firms that answer that they want to import less from China, they answer that they want to import more from neighboring countries. So they want to increase the regionalization of supply chains. So they are basically willing to pay, in general, a higher price to increase the resilience of supply chain through diversification. So it's not that they are no longer importing from China, but they are aiming to diversify more. Yeah.
Just to discuss a very quick example on what you just mentioned in terms of nearshoring and how it actually decreases welfare or doesn't really produce any massive gains, is the example of Mexico. Everyone thought when the Chinese-U.S. tariff war broke out a couple years ago that Mexico would be a massive beneficiary when it came to trade. It didn't actually happen. There are some statistics saying that between 2018 and 2021, the proportion of manufactured goods imported into the U.S. from Mexico barely changed. That's data compiled by Kearney, a consultancy. Instead, the rewards of the China boycott were reaped by low-cost Asian competitors, including Vietnam and Taiwan. So is this really just an example of nearshoring not working, or is this an example of really bad policies in Mexico and a president who's not very business friendly, even though he claims to be business friendly?
Yes, I think yes, probably if there were to be nearshoring, it will probably takes more time. I'm not so sure if we can see this just in a few years. But anyway, I tend to think that it's more a problem of domestic policies, no? To have the skills, to have the kind of strategic thinking, to put together the institutions in the country to support an upgrading in terms of productive capabilities, in terms of technological capabilities and skills. So I guess, yes, that indeed, unless Mexico and also Central American countries that have an expectation of being benefited from this change in in China-U.S. relations, it's more a problem of having in place the correct policies.
Any questions, comments, inputs, objections from the audience? I don't know if we have a mic coming.
Hi, thank you so much. Actually, amazing debate, I think, for the morning of the second day. Thank you for moderating. And very exciting topics. And I actually have 3 questions, I think, more or less to each of you. I like your, Diana, start about like strategic policy. And I wanted to ask about, what do you think, is there like a rebirth of a new industry policy rather than we're shifting from more focusing on technology and innovation to really strategically decide for the countries in terms of which areas and which priorities they can focus, so kind of new generation of industrial policy coming along the way. And then maybe, Lisandro, you can answer in terms of, we've been focusing, and of course this is the scope of the project, is that between Latin America and China, but where is in the role is the African countries in terms, maybe you can reflect a little bit, are they also integrated in this regionalization of the supply chains, and also in terms of the dependencies that we have with them, either on the raw material level. And the final question, Gabrielle, is in terms of migration and the skills, how will they actually shape also this regionalization? Do we really have to kind of also rethink in terms of new demands or new new capacities that the countries have to think, giving this the migration within Europe, but also from Latin America and maybe other other global areas. So should then industrial policy kind of really put the skills and a labor perspective at the core when they try to prioritize and strategically think in terms of the developing? So maybe you can also reflect on those kind of three areas, which I think could be interlinked, but yeah, so thanks.
Lots of great questions. Who wants to start?
I'll go briefly. So I think when people hear the word, some people hear the word industrial policy, they think it's the old-fashioned kind, where you waste government money propping up companies that are failing or they're just powerful lobbyists. So I hope the answer is yes, that we're talking about a new kind of industrial policy, which focuses much more on what are the R&D and innovation capabilities that a country has. That's much more specific than the terms in which it's usually discussed. It's not biotech, it's something quite specific. And then building around that, the infrastructure, the skills, and everything else that's needed to enable that to grow. And then other technologies, well, let's have an open world economy where you can import the ones that you need, because it's not going to be the case that every country can invent everything.
Oh yeah, very, very good point on Africa. And yeah, so the African countries have in general a very low degree of integration in global supply chains. And when we talk about these technologies, I mentioned before the study that we have looked at key technologies and the raw materials that we need to produce these key technologies in Europe, then we see that so many of them come actually from African countries, and there is a large untapped potential. So I think in terms of policies, the question, how can we help these countries in terms of building infrastructure and building capabilities, right? So not only in terms of trade, how to reduce trade barriers, but also in terms of investment in infrastructure and in capabilities to help these regions also grow. And for, I think in terms of trade and in terms of integration in supply chains, we could also help. It would be a win-win situation in the sense that we, in the European Union, we would be able to achieve more diversified supply chains and also build capabilities.
Let me play a devil's advocate here. Isn't the problem here that inherently China has lower standards in terms of, human cost of certain projects, social costs, and that's why these projects usually get approved a lot more quickly than any project that would be financed by the EU, for example? Isn't that a huge disadvantage to investment coming out of Europe?
Well, it's a question, our standards or the standards? Yeah.
I'm just saying that's been the reality over the last 10 years in terms of investment coming out of China, that the standards are just quite a bit lower. Mm-hmm. Europe shouldn't budge on that in terms of its own standards, but that's problematic, of projects just happening so much more quickly when they're financed by China.
Yeah, I mean, sure, it is, but I think then, yeah, so we have to think where is the red line where, what is our limit in terms of, so now this is also a big discussion now in the EU with the supply chain law, right? So how not only how to build more resilient supply chains, but how can we comply with working conditions in developing countries? So I think this will be, on the one side, we have, I think this is a longer discussion.
No, absolutely. And I think the aim that European companies should have in terms of diversifying their supply chains, as you rightly say, it's only complicated by the new supply chain laws, in a way, because they're quite strict, which is a good thing, but it might take a little bit longer to diversify.
Yeah, I think it depends on how this law at the end, how it will be implemented, right? Because currently this is targeted towards the big, the really large firms, which are the ones that are already able to trace their whole supply chains. And the question is, what happens then to smaller firms? But taking the perspective of the developing countries, we can also ask what happens to your supplier from which you supply, from which you source a very low amount. So are you going to still build relationships with these suppliers? So it could be that one outcome. I mean, even though in the long run it has very important objectives, in the short run, one big disadvantage could be for firms that this would even lead to a lower diversification of supply chains, so that firms can be able to really trace all suppliers. Yeah.
Kabila, your question or your answer to the question?
It's migration and yes, there is a lot of a large increase in migration within Latin America. Basically, people from Cuba and Venezuela are leaving their countries. Just to give you an example, in my country, in Uruguay, there was 23,000 Cubans arriving. So for a small country, it's quite a problem. There is a problem also in terms of human rights, because it's necessary to be sure that these people will receive the necessary support and will not be abused by other people. But in general, these are more skilled than the average of the country. They are people that arrive with some human capital, which is of course a very positive, it has a very positive effect on the economy. It was studied for the case of Chile that the migrants are really supplying a labor force in key sectors of the economy that were with a labor shortage. Just a point about the possibility of industrial policy or the strategic policy in Latin America. We have now, I think, a more pragmatic approach to industrial policy. We had a very strong, in particular in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil in the 70s, the traditional industrial policy, which was very protectionist, but it was moving towards a more export-oriented approach. It's very interesting. If you look at the late 70s, you see that manufacturing exports were increasing in Mexico, in Argentina, less in Argentina more in the 60s, but in Mexico, in Brazil, clearly. With the crisis of the 80s, there is a huge fiscal crisis. And during the 80s, Latin America was paying the debt. It was a very high burden on the fiscal side of the country. So the institutional capabilities of the state were dismounted in this period. And in the 90s, there was a very ideological approach in which all kind of government intervention was set aside. So now we are coming back. We are with a more pragmatic approach to industrial policy. We see the left-wing parties having this new perspective on how to diversify the economy, how to encourage technical change, but at the same time keeping the economy open to international trade and looking more at exports.
That's the hope, at least. Do we have time for more questions? Yes? Okay. Yes.
Thank you. I would like to thank the great panel for the great insights. I have two observations, possibly on this, again, on these global value chains, Caroline, again. What on the framing or reframing the competition race with China, I think is very important, and the new trends on nearshoring and reshoring and so on. So part of my recent research, I mean, with my brilliant friends Ariel Wirkerman at Goldsmith, has been looking at what Europe is doing in terms of global value chains. So what we find is that in Europe, we are reshoring or nearshoring in terms of input. So basically, European countries, they source from within Europe mainly. So shifting from the Asian macro area and China again. But they're still dependent on value add or on final demand for the Asian market. So this is something that might not be sustainable in the long run. I mean, talking about democratic multilateralism, Gabriel. And I was wondering, what are your views about this, whether really nearshoring and reshoring can be, again, taken with caution by looking at by going a little bit more in depth into what Europe is doing in terms of nearshoring. The second one is on digital trade. So issues related to trade of digital goods, which pertain also with the objective of this project, is basically not very explored. I mean, we trade data, and there's a lot of asymmetries in regulating data and the use of personal data and the intensity of data in traded goods and services. So this is something that probably would be important to reflect upon, and there's a lot of research that needs to be done on this. What are your views about this? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, this is a very important point. So because we talk about dependency as from inputs, right? But if we look at dependency, we could think of dependency as a final demand, right? And if you look at where the value added of Germany is going, 2.7% of the value added is going to China. If compared to France, in France is 1.7. So meaning that the German economy for German economy, final demand in China is much more important than the average EU. Right? And so in a sense, we should talk about these dependencies in two ways. Yeah, not only as a supplier, but also as a destination country of exports. Yeah, that's true.
Two more questions or comments? Yep, Oliver.
Thank you. I would have many questions, but I will concentrate on one. So this is related to aging societies. So basically, we have to tackle all these changes in aging societies, and this is especially true for Europe. And the standard answer is early retirement. Look at France, look at German manufacturing, where the answer to the transformation to e-mobility is early retirement. So I guess my question is to Diane. So how do good policies look like to empower the elderly workers in this transformation?
I find that early retirement response very bizarre, because clearly what we need is later retirement. We've got to carry on working for longer, because current production is what enables current consumption. You can't eat future outputs. And that obviously goes to pensions policies and fiscal policies. And actually I have a PhD student at the moment who's working on exactly how do you achieve pensions policies that are fiscally sustainable, that cover enough of the population, and that are politically feasible to deliver as well. So it's a tricky political economy problem, and I don't think any country has solved that. So I agree wholeheartedly with the spirit of your question that we need to think about this. I mean, the alternative is migration, but the experience of the past decades is that That can't happen too quickly. Migrants are very good for the economies that they go to, but there are clearly social and cultural costs when it happens too quickly. So we'll find some balance, but I think the politics of getting there will be interesting, to say the least.
Yep, another comment here.
So I'm a little surprised that all of the emphasis is on rearranging production and that side of the market and not talking about the skill gaps that exist and the lack of skills. So just wanting to create high-wage jobs really depends upon creating high-skilled employees to match that. And it's so obvious in the case of Latin America, where the skill gaps are really huge. And the places that we're starting to deal with that, Chile, Peru, Mexico, have suddenly taken a political backstep and sort of are in the process of dismantling their schools. So I don't see how you can just think that welfare is going to be enhanced without, in fact, changing the skills and the growth rates of these different economies.
Let's leave that as a comment and an input. We have another comment or question in the back, but very important input.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out two things. One is that there is a difference between trade integration and technological change. Trade integration, we've learned this, is very, very local in its impact. And so the policies need to be tailored to that, whereas technological change is pervasive. So that really does require different types of policies. So that's maybe a comment. But I also wanted to point out there's an elephant in the room, and it almost stepped on the stage, and that's the question of geopolitics. And so the deal with China really was, let's give you guys market access to our consumption markets, and we'll import inputs from you. And the deal was that, somehow we'll see some convergence in values and so on. And we see how things are playing out right now. And so the questions here are not just about economics. We see how these things are playing out in Ukraine. And, in France, in CEPI, we're starting actually within the group of economists, we're actually trying to put that dimension into the discussion, because it's not just about jobs or growth of income. There are bigger things at stake, and it all intertwines. But I think it's important to put to show the elephant and make it visible in the circles that we participate in. Thank you.
I did mention geopolitics, so I let the elephant wave its trunk off the side of the stage. But there's also a rhinoceros on the stage, which is that the Chinese economy is actually somewhat fragile and it might not continue its growth path, and there will be political instability within China as well. But weaving in the politics of all this is certainly very important.
And working politics into economic models will be the toughest job for all of you, obviously. On that note, we'll leave it here. I want to thank everyone so much for their comments and their attention, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you.